So when you're producing a forecast, very often you are going to start by looking at your history and you're going to try and find seasonality, patterns, and trends within that as a way of helping you plan your future. Now, with Planning Analytics Workspace, we have a feature now that is called forecasting, and that feature allows us to do just that, but automatically. Now, it's quite an involved feature with a lot of moving parts, so I will be producing a somewhat more detailed video that will explain some of that and give some ideas and tips, and that will be available in a link at the end of this video. But here we're going to look at simply how to use the feature. So in this case, what I need to do is have an exploration view, as we see here, and we need our time dimension or dimensions to be in our columns. So in my case, I've got a single time dimension where the month and years are combined, and I have that across the columns here. But you could also, if you have separate dimensions, for example, a year and a month dimension, you can also nest those in the columns and it will still pick it up because, and this is something that's quite useful to know, it's not really looking at these as if they are months and years. So in my case, where I've got March 21 highlighted here, the system doesn't know that that is March 21. It just knows that it is the umpteenth element in my dimension. So you can start using it on other things as well. So for example, if you are using versions sort of as a time dimension, so if in your cube you only have months, but you have versions that are showing your history in there. So if you have a version called FY19, FY20, and then FY21 is where you're doing your forecasting, you can nest your version and your month dimension as well, and it will still be able to use that. But in my case, I'm wanting to produce a forecast for the revenue, and I want to do it across these months. So I'm going to highlight in the rows which elements I would like to produce my forecast for. And up the top here, I can click this forecast button, which looks like a little line chart, and then it brings up a navigation pane on the right, or another pane where I can fill in some more of the details for how I want to run this. So first of all, I need to tell it which time periods I want to produce a plan for. So I want to produce a plan from January 21 up until the end of December 2022. And it gives me a tick box here for saving statistical details as comments. So what will happen here is when I actually run all the way through this and I produce a forecast and put those values into the cells that we have here, if I have it ticked, the first cell for each row will get a comment applied to it that has some of the statistical detail that was used when producing the forecast. So it will tell me things like how many months are within a season for me. And then if I jump over to the advanced tab, so the first thing we get is back to that season and seasonality. So we have a tick box where by default, it will try and auto-detect my seasonality. So in that case, it will go away and it will look at your history and it will try and find the interval of your pattern. So if I untick it, I can instead tell it how often my seasonality is occurring, the intervals. So in my case where I'm working on years, if I enter a 12, it is a 12 monthly band of seasonality that I'm saying that I have. Now, potentially, it can be quite a good thing to have it auto-detect that seasonality because it might find that your seasonality is actually occurring on a different pattern to what you think it is. So you may be viewing things on a yearly basis when really your historic data indicates that there seems to be more of a quarterly pattern occurring. But also, it can be a good idea to type it in yourself because sometimes it can find patterns that aren't necessarily the ones you want to work on. So it's possible that you have both a quarterly and a yearly pattern that are happening, and you can then choose which one you want to go for. But I'm going to leave it on auto detect here. And then we get this other tick box option. So I've got two choices. One is use historical data in the exploration. And what that means is that when it's deciding which history to use, it will use only what I have given it in the view that I am looking at. And that can be very useful when perhaps, say, your business operating model changed at a certain point in time. What I could do is say I changed the way I operate in 2017. I could bring 18, 19, 20, and then my forecast into this view, and I select that, and then it will just use 2018 forwards. Whereas if all of your history is usable and it should contain similar sort of patterns and ways of working, I can instead just say use historical data in the TM1 cube, and then it will go away and use all of your history. So depending on how your business operates, this is where you need to use some common sense about which ones to apply in there. But I'm going to take all of the data in the TM1 cube in this case because I just want to show 19 and 20 in my view because that's all I'm interested in looking at. But I know I also have 2018 in the history that I would like to include. And generally speaking, the more history you have, the better chance it has of finding seasonality and trend within that, as long as your business operating models have not significantly changed the way the data looks. But then my final sort of option up in the main section that I'm going to use on a regular basis is to ignore historical data from. So in this case, I can choose to exclude a certain period while it's still being shown in my view. So I'm going to leave that unticked for the moment, and I'm going to jump down here and click the preview button down at the bottom. And to be able to do this preview, you can have a maximum of 25 rows selected. If you have more than that, it will not bring a preview back for you. But in my preview here, I see it has produced a low accuracy prediction. And what that means is it reckons it has under 30% chance of being correct. So looking at this, my solid blue line, that's my actuals. That is the history that I have. The blue dots are the forecast points that it has predicted for me. And this blue band that we see here is the confidence range. So although it's saying that in April it will be about a 10,000 forecast, it's also saying realistically it could be anywhere between 0 and sort of 35,000. So that's not a very good forecast, and it is telling us that. But I can see here, just using my eyes and common sense, what the reason for that is. So looking at this, 2018 and 2019, they're not exactly the same, but they look like they have similar patterns within them. So they both have a peak in the summer months and a smaller peak around the winter months. But then we have 2020, which gets crazy in comparison. As we can see, the store was completely closed for a couple of months. Now, exponential smoothing is taking all of your history and trying to find a pattern within that. It doesn't know what has been going on in the world in 2020. So I need to tell it to exclude that time period. So I'm going to do it with this ignore historical data from. My other option would be to just hide it from my view before I run this, and then use the use historical data in the exploration option. But now if I go back to my preview, this time we can see it has produced a high prediction accuracy, and we can see we now have a much better looking forecast for us to use. And what I can do, because I had selected multiple rows to do the forecasting on, I can flip between them and see what it looks like for the other stores as well. And of course, what we should know is not all of them are going to produce high accuracy forecasts. So here we have a store that has a medium accuracy. And in this case, we can see that it's found a trend, but it hasn't found any seasonality within that. And that's going to happen sometimes. Your data, not all data contains seasonality and trend within it. It's down to what you're planning as to whether these sorts of things exist. Sometimes just using your history alone to produce a forecast is not the correct thing to do, and sometimes it is. Now, the brilliance of this feature is that you can run it on pretty much anything, so you can always try it out in this preview mode and have a look and decide whether it's something you want to work with. And when you decide it is something you want to work with, you press this forecast button, and then what we will see is the data gets put into our cells here. And as we can see, we have some blue triangles over here. These are the comments giving us the detail of what it found, and they are controlled by whether or not you have that ticked. So that is what we get there. Now, what I can also do, so there I was doing my forecasting on the lowest level, so on the stores themselves. I could also do the forecasting on a consolidation. And I can do exactly the same sort of setup that I did before. And you don't have to go to this preview mode first, you could just go straight to forecast. But here I can see on a GB level, it's actually a pretty accurate forecast, or a pretty high forecast that it's producing. So I'm going to forecast that. And we see it has changed the values in the consolidation. Now, what happens when we change a consolidation's values, it goes to the default behavior. So the default behavior is that if the cells underneath the consolidated ones, if some of them already had values in them, it will proportionally spread your new total over those leaf level cells, as we see here. So in my case, it's ended up missing out a load of other stores that I would have expected to be part of the plan. Now, if none of them had any data in before you run that forecast, so if I try that again, if none of them have anything in, it will do an equal spread to all of the cells underneath it. So you need to be really careful, as with anything, if you're changing data at a consolidated level, be very sure of what is underneath it. Because potentially, if you try and do this at too high a level, all of a sudden you might be spreading data over millions and millions of cells, and that may not be what you want to do. Now, finally, what we'll move to is, of course, in some applications, the place where you keep your actuals and the place where you want your forecast to be are not always the same. So you may have a version dimension, for example, where you have a version simply called actuals. And if that's the only place your actuals are, what I can do is go into here and go through the forecasting just as I did before. But these extra options that we have down the bottom here allow us to send the results of our forecast to a different place. So I can choose the version dimension, version hierarchy, and I can say I want to put it into the current version as my plan. So you'll be able to make these selections for any of the title or context elements. So they're the ones that are not in your rows or your columns. And if you run that, it will move the data over to the version called current. So if I then swap it back, we see it's put the data in there. And as a very, very last quick thing to show, I'm just going to point out that when you do go into that preview pane, there is a statistical details section here that you can click on. And this I'll cover off a bit more in the other video that we'll hopefully have a link to at the end of this one. But this explains how it has come up with the plan. So it will tell us what sort of seasonality it's found. So like I was saying before, if this was a 12, it would be saying your seasonality is on a yearly basis. For this particular store, it found my seasonality was on an 11-month basis. Bit strange, but it is what it is. And we see a lot of the information here just generally that it has calculated within its statistical models. And if you want to find more information on those, you can also click this Learn More option over here, and that will take you to the IBM help pages that gives a little bit of an explanation about that. But of course, if you don't want to get into the details of statistical planning, you don't have to. You can just use it as it is and sort of focus on the prediction accuracy it's giving you. If it says you have a low prediction accuracy for something, it is probably one that you don't really want to use as your plan. But if it has high prediction accuracy, that indicates that it really has found good seasonality and trends or whatever it may be within your data. So it may at least be a good starting point, because what you can get is it produces a baseline for you. And you can still change these numbers after the fact. So you can use this as a way of giving you a good baseline, a good starting point, and then you can apply your knowledge to tweak that plan into what you really want it to be.